Well, thank you for joining us for the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison, the chair of the Rev 250 Advisory Board. Also, I teach history at Suffolk University. And Revolution 250 is a consortium of about 60 plus organizations in and around Massachusetts looking to commemorate the events of the American Revolution. And on our podcast today, we have an historian, a journalist, Rick Atkinson. And thank you for joining us, Rick.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for having me this morning.
And Rick was actually a reporter for 17 years, starting off with a newspaper in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and then he went to the Kansas City Times. And his story about the 1966 West Point class, which became his book, The Long Gray Line, the reporting won the Pulitzer Prize for journalism in 1982. And then he subsequently has written a couple of books about the Persian Gulf War, Crusade, and In the Company of Soldiers. And it was while he was on assignment for the Washington Post with General David Petraeus in 2003 that he learned that his volume, An Army at Dawn, had won the Pulitzer Prize for history. And the Army at Dawn was the first volume in a trilogy on the Second World War, and now he is immersed in a trilogy on the American Revolution. And the first volume, The British Are Coming, covers the years from Lexington to Princeton. And it's really a magnificent book. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that introduction.
And so what made you turn to the American Revolution as a subject for treatment like this?
I've asked myself that same question. I spent 15 years looking at the American role in the liberation of Europe in World War II. And the obvious thing, and I was thinking about it as I was finishing volume 3 of that trilogy in 2013, the obvious thing would have been to pivot to the Pacific, to do for that what I had done for the theaters in Western Europe and the Mediterranean. And Bob, I just didn't have the heart for it. 15 years was a long time to spend. I'm a Europeanist. I don't have the same emotional attachment to the Pacific. And I would have had to start the war all over again at Pearl Harbor or even earlier. And that was really disheartening. Finally, and probably most important, I have been fixated, as I suspect you and many listeners have been, since I was a kid, with the story, our founding story of the Revolution. And so I just thought, well, I'll pivot to a different war in a different century and see what I can find.
Great. And although it is, as you say, a familiar story, you do bring a lot that is new to the fore. The stories of the ordinary soldiers and even the way you frame it. The book begins with King George III inspecting the fleet at Portsmouth. And it seems really a high point for the empire.
Yeah, it is a high point for the empire. The book opens in June 1773. That's the year that the phrase, the sun never sets when the British Empire was coined. It's exactly 10 years after the creation of the first British Empire, with Britain's victory over France and Spain in the 7 Years' War, where they had gained a lot of territory, including Canada and Sugar Islands and parts of India and so on. And they are at the high point. They see themselves really as rewarded for their virtue and their capability militarily, among other things. And so that's a wonderful place to start, because George goes to inspect the fleet, a famous expedition that he makes. George never goes anywhere. In his long life, he never leaves England. He never even goes to Scotland. But on this occasion in June of 1773, he goes to Portsmouth and spends several days there inspecting the fleet. He's going to do it again several years later in 1778, when they're just about to begin war with France. But it's an opportunity for him to preen and to understand how the mightiest fleet the world has ever seen has come together. And so that's a great place to start, because, of course, there's trouble brewing on the Western horizon.
Right. And I like the way too you frame the book. I wonder how much of what you knew did you had to put aside because you're really focusing on. We're reading this, it seems, for the first time. You have 4 chapters on the, or 3 chapters on the, 4 chapters on the Canadian expedition, for example, and 4 on New York, the New York campaign. And it really is looking at this in a new way, which seems to be the way people would have looked at it at the time.
Yeah, well, thank you. That is the best compliment I could possibly get, that you're looking at it for the first time, because that, as a narrative writer, is my objective. This is well-trod territory. It's not like no one has ever discovered the American Revolution. Some of the greatest historians in our national history have done very well by it. But my ambition is to write it in a way that it seems fresh to you, that it seems new. I had to put aside, I suppose, a number of the myths that we've all grown up with. I hadn't swallowed the whole George Washington cherry tree mythology completely, but I wanted to see Washington, who has to be the central figure in this story of our revolution, in the same way that I looked at Eisenhower for 15 years. And I come away 15 years with Dwight Eisenhower believing that he is, in fact, a great man. And I have ever more respect for him the more time I spend. But I know that he has feet of clay. I see that he is not a particularly capable, he's not a great tactician by any means. He's got deficiencies as a field marshal. And so does Washington. And, Washington and Eisenhower have quite a lot in common, actually, despite their very disparate backgrounds. And so I'm trying to look at Washington as I begin this project as if it's a blank sheet of paper that I'm trying to pretend like I know nothing about him and to build him from the ground up. That's my objective.
Yeah. And you do say that as a political general, Washington would have few equals and no superior in American history, which I think is a very good judgment. And he doesn't appear until the 4th chapter of the book. That is, things are really underway before he comes onto the scene, which is interesting for the guy who's going to be the central figure.
Yeah, and there's obviously quite a bit that happens before he gets there, including Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, which makes his job more difficult in some ways. The war is well underway. He's a Virginian in the midst of these New Englanders. He has nothing good to say privately about New Englanders. He talks about the dirty New Englanders, and he's disparaging of his junior officers. So having him come into the story as the story has been launched, I think is how he would see it himself. And he's got work to do. Among other things, he has got to recognize the sacrifice that these men, these shopkeepers, these farmers, these merchants are making to serve at his side. He's got 200 slaves back in Mount Vernon taking care of business while he's away. He doesn't get that at first. And one of the secrets, I think, of his leadership ultimately is that he has to feel in his bones. And the men have to know that he feels in his bones the great sacrifice that they're making. And that is where this mystical bond will begin to take hold between leader and led. And that's true of every successful leader.
Yeah. And in addition to these mystical bonds, you also have the practical concerns of anyone with an organization this size. I mean, you talk about General Howe calculating that to move his regiments out of Boston, he's going to need 3,662 horses and 50 tons of oats and hay every day. I mean, just the logistical problems each army has would seem overwhelming.
It's so true. Omar Bradley famously said that amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. I try to be a professional in the sense that I do try to understand whatever war I'm writing about, the logistical obstacles that prevent victory or that complicate victory. And it's never more complicated than it is for the British waging an expeditionary war across 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail. Now, they have fought expeditionary wars, including here in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, but they've never tried something like this. And it's one of the miscalculations that George and his ministers make about how difficult it's going to be. So I do spend a lot of time in the archives at Kew and elsewhere trying to get inside the guts of the logistical operation. How many tons of candles you need in New York in the winter of 1776, 77, for example. The issue, horses, shipping horses across the North Atlantic in the winter turns out to be really difficult. It kills as many horses, more horses actually, than you can actually salvage from that kind of operation. So this is, an integral part of the war for both sides. The Americans have their own logistical problems, needless to say. Washington writes 70 letters, official letters, in January and February of 1776, and more than half of them refer to munitions, often in pleading, fretful terms, particularly about gunpowder, which he just calls the thing. So this is how war works in the 18th century. In the 21st century, it's hard to wage expeditionary war, whether it's in Central Asia in 2021 or in North America in the 1770s.
What really surprised you the most as you've been undertaking this to retell this well-known story?
Yeah, well, as you know better than I, surprise is one of the reasons you keep doing it, right? It's the mystery of the next unopened archival box. It's the unexpected nuance of personality. I'm perpetually surprised by the incompetence of the British strategically. George, who's really driving the train strategically, it must be said, but also his close ministers, including Germain, who's the American secretary, and Lord North, who's the first minister, prime minister, we'd call him today, make several strategic miscalculations that they cling to virtually to the end of the war. One of the crippling miscalculations that they have made is that if the American colonies are permitted to slip away, if the rebellion succeeds, it will be the end of the British Empire. That we, the Americans, are so critical to their success, so critical to their mercantile approach to the world, that if we're not around to provide them with raw materials and to buy their finished products and to basically ensure that the sugar islands, which is where the real money is, don't fall into our orbit as an independent country, well, it's all going to come tumbling down. And George refers to this over and over and over again. And we see it, into 1779, 1780. It's an article of faith with all of them. Now, it's false, as we're going to see, because we do break away. The British Empire has a bit of a setback. They lose land mass and things are difficult. But they're going to come roaring back with another British Empire that's bigger, badder than ever. So, the fact that these that this fundamental misconception is not more fully questioned. It's not that there aren't people in Britain questioning whether it's true. Adam Smith, whose Wealth of Nations is published in 1776, questions whether it's true, but nobody in the political firmament among those who are in charge really seems to question it. So, and there are other examples too. So the British continue to surprise me. I adore them. I'm a real Anglophile. I don't disparage the way they fought the war, and I don't dismiss the reason that they felt compelled to do it, but they're wrong. And the errors that they make in their thinking really are quite stunning.
They are, and actually some of the characters who have come into high regard in some ways, we look at, or low regard, we look at somewhat differently. General Clinton comes across a bit better in this treatment. Of course, he comes across pretty well. He tries to make himself come across pretty well in his memoir, but you do have a more nuanced picture of General Clinton, and you have General Gates actually is an able commander in this book. I mean, we see these characters we know are going to have something of a different trajectory that come across a bit differently here.
Yeah, I think that's true, Bob, and I think that part of the issue is that we've tended to caricature the British generally as those morons in red coats who can't do anything right, and they're not. They have the greatest navy the world's ever seen. They have a large, professional, experienced army. They have generals who have been in combat a lot, including those you just mentioned. So I find that trying to understand the nuances of them, I mean, they didn't suddenly become major commanders of the major war that Britain's fighting because they're idiots. Clinton in particular beguiles me. He's going to be the commander-in-chief succeeding General Howe longer than anyone for the British in the course of the war for 4 years. He's from New York. Originally, his father had been he grew up in New York, at least for much of his childhood, because his father had been the governor of New York. His father was an admiral. So he knows America somewhat. He certainly knows it topographically. And he's a tortured soul. He's got lots of baggage that he's carrying. And of course, he's trying to make himself look good in his memoirs. That's what memoirs are for. But he's tactically quite capable, particularly when he's not in ultimate command. He's probably best as a deputy, which is the role that he serves for so long. When he becomes the commander-in-chief, then some of his demons begin to weigh him down. But I find him absolutely entrancing as a military figure to study, to watch him try to figure this out. He's got a bad hand that he's trying to play, and he plays it pretty well sometimes, all the while nursing grievances and feeling sorry for himself and all the rest of that. He is not a good political general, unlike Washington, unlike Eisenhower. So that is one of his great deficiencies.
Yeah, and unlike Howe, he does say, you say that when his study of Caesar and Roman history, he was actually more drawn to the barbarian side. And there's also that comment he makes early on that maybe the best thing the British could do is withdraw to Florida and Canada and let the Americans fight it out amongst themselves, and then they'll ask us to come back. So,
yeah, and of course that falls on deaf ears. That's not what the king wants to hear. It's not what any of them want to hear in London. But he is thinking outside the box, to use a contemporary metaphor. We see him tactically in the Battle of New York, for example, when the British land on first Staten Island and then Long Island, and it's his plan to outflank the rebel defenses, which works brilliantly. So we see he's really quite capable. Howe resents him a bit. He's a pest. He's always nattering on about my plan is probably better than yours, General Howe. But it's true. His plan usually is better than General Howe's. Bunker Hill would have gone differently had Clinton been in command, I believe. He'd actually gone out and reconned the rebel positions early that morning, June 17th, 1775, which is more than anybody else had done who was senior commander. So, we're going to be with him for a long time. We're going to see him struggle with this mightily. And I find it as a psychological portrait a very, very compelling figure.
Great, thanks. So we're talking to Rick Atkinson, the author of The British Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777. I hesitate to ask about how the next volumes are coming, because I am looking forward to reading them. So.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to you reading them too at some point. Well, I'm plugging away. There's nothing like quarantine to make you keep your nose to the grindstone. The fact is, as you well know, that libraries and archives and battlefields been mostly closed for the past year has not made it any easier. Volume 2 will pick up where Volume 1 ends in 1777. The British are going to be coming down through Ticonderoga, which they take easily, and they're headed towards Saratoga. We know what happens there, and I'm going to end it, I believe, Bob, at the Battle of Charleston in May of 1780, which is the worst defeat for the Americans in the entire course of the war. Entire army is lost. More than 5,000 men surrendered. It looks as though maybe things are finally turning around for the British. There's a lot that happens in between those two events, needless to say, Brandywine and Germantown and Monmouth and all the rest of it, Oriskany. So I'm diligently plowing through everything I can lay my hands on. I was supposed to go spend last June in France and in London, back at Kew, where I've spent many weeks for various books, but that didn't happen. So I'm aware, as you certainly are, given the name of the show, of the semi-quincentennial that's approaching with the 250th anniversary hoopla. I think there'll be a little hoopla that will begin in 2025 and hopefully go right through 2033. And if you're in this business, you've got your eye on that mark. So I feel pretty good about where I am. I have not begun writing yet, and I won't until next year sometime. The way I work, I spend usually about 6 months outlining the book. It's a terribly tedious chore, but I find it to be critical. And I'm hoping to start doing that next summer, and then I need about a year to write it. So that's my plan.
Good. Well, that's a great plan. And another particular favorite of ours in Boston, of course, is Henry Knox. And I note that Henry Knox appears more in this volume than Thomas Jefferson does. And I'm wondering if that analogy is going to hold in the next volumes, as Knox really does seem to be a critical figure.
Yeah, well, I am a military historian, so the military figures tend to predominate. Jefferson makes a cameo basically in Volume 1. He writes very nicely and tries to sum up what it is the war is all about. But Knox, of course, is a fabulous, unlikely character. He shows that Washington has an extraordinarily fine eye for subordinate talent. I mean, he sees this overweight Boston bookseller who's 25 years old and suddenly intuits that this is going to be the father of American artillery. It's going to take Knox a little while to get there, but not long. And Knox is the same way when it comes to Nathaniel Greene. Again, a very improbable character, Quaker anchorsmith with virtually no military experience. And he's going to be arguably the finest American general of the war. Washington sees the latent talent in these men. He also sees that they are loyal. That's very important to him. And that they're capable organizationally, which is something that Washington has in spades, again, in common with Eisenhower. Very fine, a mind organized for executive action, clear administrative capabilities. And Knox has that too, and so does Greene. I mean, Greene has it to the extent that he's stuck with being a quartermaster. So I'm intrigued by these characters, not only for their battlefield capabilities, but also for their abilities as executives in trying to organize this very difficult rebellion that they're running. They're insurrectionists, but their capabilities as executives are what is going to cause the insurrection to succeed or fail.
And it really is that allows events like Trenton and Princeton to happen. I mean, those are superb military actions in really an unlikely time when the rebellion seemed to be ending. The army was wilting away, melting away.
Yeah, I mean, it's so true. As improbable as anything in American history, I would argue. Washington is down to about 3,000 men in this bedraggled retreat across New Jersey after being evicted from New York and not showing his chops as a general worth a damn, frankly. He's out generaled at Long Island. He's out generaled at Tips Bay. He's out generaled, one thing after another. Fort Washington is a catastrophe. Greene has a big role in that catastrophe. And so, as he writes to his brother, Washington does, I think the game is pretty near up. And who can gainsay that? Desperation causes men to do desperate things, and the attack on Trenton Christmas night, 1776, is a desperate thing, but it's very well considered. Washington is no mean commander when he puts his mind to organizing something. And again, with the help of capable subordinates, he organizes this attack. It doesn't go as planned. It never does. No plan ever survives contact with ice in the Delaware River, much less the enemy. But it is well enough constructed and conceived that even when 2 of the 3 crossings cannot occur because of the ice, it still is a successful attack. And I have to say the hair on the back of my neck stands up just talking about it now. It's such an improbable, miraculous thing for them. And then, to me, one of the great signs of Washington's capabilities as a general, and I take him to task for his shortcomings, but one of his great capabilities, one of his great signature events is that he doesn't just collect his winnings, cross back to the west side of the Delaware. He doubles down and does it again. He crosses the river again. He occupies Trenton. He baits, gulls the British into attacking him there, and then not sure what he's going to do, but he comes up with the idea of, going exactly where the British don't expect him to go, around their left flank onto Princeton and attack the rear guard there and destroys the rear guard there. So this is pretty good generalship. Washington is going to have a lot of failings as a field general, but here he saves the day. He probably saves the cause, and certainly gives himself and those around him confidence that, hey, we're not completely hapless. And it is a thrilling sequence of events in American history.
It really is. And the way you've told it is also thrilling, both now and in the book. Now, I'm wondering how all of this plays back in England as people are reading. Parliament is debating the conduct of the war. How does all of this play to the British public?
It's so interesting, isn't it, Bob? More than once, the analogy between Britain and the first British Empire in the 1770s has reminded me of us today. Big navy, big capable army, extraordinarily powerful commercial entity, and so on. The British are feeling pretty good about things until they get word of Trenton and Princeton. There is a recognition in Britain among the king and his ministers that this needs to be a short, quick war because the French and probably the Spanish and perhaps the Dutch are looking to exploit British weakness and to, in the case of the French particularly, to gain revenge for the defeat in the 7 Years' War. Britain has no allies. Another World War II truism, the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. And Britain is going to learn that to its sorrow, that they have no friends. Now, they can buy some Germans, and they will rent 30,000 of them, of course. But when the war becomes more protracted, as it's going to with the events of Lexington and Princeton, and then, of course, 1777 is going to be basically a calamity for them. There is a realization that this is going to turn into something bigger and badder than just a counterinsurrection against some distant colonies. It's going to become a world war, which, of course, it does. There is an opposition, a vibrant opposition in Britain to the king and his government. It's never very potent politically. They never are able to pull themselves together, but they've got some strong voices speaking against them. Chatham, for example, William Pitt. He's not in favor of independence for the Americans, but he is basically in favor of everything else they want. Edmund Burke, who's extraordinary eloquence in enunciating the foolhardiness of this protracted expeditionary war, it's very uncomfortable for Lord North and others who have to face him in the House of Commons. Among the people, among 11 million Britons, there's a disquiet about it. Most people are going on about their lives. It doesn't really affect them. That sounds somewhat familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
There are merchants who feel uncomfortable with the fact that they're risking their livelihood with the way things are going. But for the most part, the country is sticking behind George, North, Germain, and the rest of the gang running it. And that's going to persist really until it does become a world war. And then things get very dicey with, of course, a proposed French and Spanish invasion of England, of all things.
Yeah, there's one member of parliament who says to North that you began the war on the presumption that the Americans were cowards and the French were idiots, that not anticipating where it would go, as no one does. I think we are just about out of time, and we don't want to take you away from working on volume 2 and 3. I just want to remind everyone that the book is The British Are Coming, and it ends. You have a marvelous eye for the phrase or the telling detail. You also write great phrases, but it ends with this wonderful thing scribbled on the orderly book of the 2nd New York Regiment. The rising world shall sing of us 1,000 years to come and tell our children's children the wonders we have done. Just think about an ordinary soldier writing this and knowing that they are part of this. And the way you tell this story without putting them on a pedestal, but inevitably that's where we're going to see them. So it's a great achievement on your part.
Well, thank you for that. It's it's a great achievement on the part of the American Republic, and I hope that in these difficult times that it's possible to look back without lionizing them excessively, without failing to see their shortcomings, without failing to recognize that Washington died with more than 300 slaves at Mount Vernon, which is you cannot square that circle morally. But nevertheless, there are things to be proud of, things to learn, things to reflect on that should be of great comfort and solace to us in 2021.
Great. So thank you very much, Rick Atkinson, and thank you for listening. And I look forward to rereading this book, and I encourage others to do the same. So thank you for joining us this morning.